Okay, everyone, welcome. I'm Suzanne Wons. I'm the Executive Director at the Harvard Law School Library. And on behalf of the library, I'd like to thank you all for coming to today's book talk, which is on Patients with Passports, Medical Tourism, Law, and Ethics, Professor Glenn Cohen's new book. We're very excited to have you all here and very excited to hear what our distinguished panel will say about the book. And I did want to mention that the talk is being videotaped today, so if there's time for questions at the end and you ask any questions, those will be part of the recording. I just want to make sure everybody knows that. And then I'll just very quickly introduce our panelists and we can get the talk started. So first we have, of course, Professor I. Glenn Cohen, Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and also Faculty Director at the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. We also have Professor Amitabh Chandra, Professor of Public Policy and Director of Health Policy Research at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Then we have Alicia Eliyamin, Lecturer of Global Health at the Department of Global Health and Population at Harvard School of Public Health. And finally, we have Professor Nir Eyal, Associate Professor of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School. And I will hand it over to Professor Cohen.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming here. Thank you to my army of research assistants, some of whom are here, who helped make this book a reality. I knew nothing about, for example, the inter-EU directive in EU law and medical tourism, but they educated me very well. Thank you to the Radcliffe Institute that gave me a fellowship to end up finishing this book, and to the Greenwald Foundation that supported my work for a while. Thank you to many members of the faculty, some of whom I see here, for years of conversations on this topic, reading drafts, pushing me in all the best ways, and all the people who I did workshops with in various parts of the world on this topic. And thank you so much for the library. It's really a wonderful service you do putting these things together, and I'm so glad to be here. One piece of disclosure, I have occasionally done consulting for companies interested in getting in this business, so, take it with a grain of salt, not too much, not as much as I would like. So if you're out there watching it and you want to hire me, I could use a vacation house, just saying, but for the most part, it's been a little something here or there. Okay. So take a look at the big picture. This was a book we did 2 years ago, a book I edited on the globalization of health, which Nir, among others, has chapters in. And again, I want to situate medical tourism to begin with within this broader phenomenon. Healthcare expenditures in the United States are currently about 18-19% of GDP. The expectation is if the slope continued, that would go up dramatically. And in general, healthcare is expensive all across the world, maybe more expensive in the US than many places, but there is a strong desire to reduce costs, and medical tourism is one big way in which we reduce the costs, but it's part of a broader network of the globalization of healthcare. And just to sketch this for a second, the globalization of healthcare can take many forms. We've got medical migration, the brain drain. So the US, the UK, Canada, we attract many nurses and physicians from India, from sub-Saharan Africa. And in so doing, we reduce our own costs while in some ways exacerbating the shortage of doctors there in places like Sierra Leone, for example, where we know the number of physicians is at an all-time low and has created problems in managing the Ebola outbreak. There's telemedicine. Examples include teleradiology, someone else reads the scan, or even telerobotics and telesurgery, where you'll have the doctor in one place controlling a robot in another place. So here the patient and the doctor stays put, but there is a way in which we link them for diagnosis or treatment. We have research and development done for drug products and devices abroad. And then we have medical tourism. Medical tourism, which is the focus of this book, is the travel of patients from one country, what I call the home country, to another country, the destination country, for the primary purpose of getting health care. These are interrelated in important ways, but you have to understand the interrelationships are not equal. There are countries like India, for example, that are both sources of medical migration, but also winners or destinations for medical tourism. There are other places like Ghana, where the flow is just in one direction. They are sources of migration, not sources of tourism. But all of this works together. Okay. Now, one level of articulation down, this is the new book, the focus of today's talk, medical tourism, in our discussion. It's useful to think about medical tourism as having a few components. And here I find it useful to actually divide it in two different ways. Before I do, let me just point out, I don't have a pointer, but this and this is Bowman Grad Hospital, one of the industry leaders in Bangkok, Thailand. Look closely, and if I asked you, which Marriott Conference Center is this in America, you probably could make a few guesses, but would you think that this was a facility in Thailand? I assure you that the tertiary care centers available to the average Thai person, much less fancy and ritzy than this is. So how do I divide the industry? The first way is actually just based on money and about who pays. So first we've got self-paid, that is uninsured or underinsured individuals who are traveling abroad, largely for affordability reasons, sometimes for other reasons. Second, we've got insurer-prompted medical tourism. This is people whose insurance company, they have insurance, they have health insurance, but their insurer is incentivizing them to go abroad. So for example, ABC News ran a story last year about an insurer who was sending patients to Costa Rica for gastric bypass and would give them a $2,000 check on top of paying all their medical expenses and giving them the time off to encourage them, because as I'll show you in a moment, this can be win-win from a financial perspective. And the third piece of this is what I call government-prompted or government-covered medical tourism. So in the EU, this is very robust. There is a patient care directive for cross-border care that requires you to reimburse under certain conditions. But there have also been discussions about whether Medicare, for example, should cover medical retirement in Mexico. A large number of Americans travel to Mexico for their retirement due to the lower cost of living. So that's one way of dividing the world. The other, which really tracks the way I've divided the book, is based on the kinds of things people are seeking and the kinds of ethical issues that are being raised. So first you've got medical tourism for things legal in both the patient's home country and the destination country. Cardiac bypass, hip replacement, cosmetic surgery. Then you've got medical tourism for things that are legal in the destination country, but not the home country, what I sometimes call circumvention tourism. So this is travel for abortion, travel for assisted suicide, travel for reproductive technologies, travel for stem cell therapies, which may not be available in the US, and FDA may prohibit their marketing, but available in China, for example. And last, you've got medical tourism for things that are illegal in both places. And here the main chapter discussing this has to do with transplant tourism. It is illegal to buy and sell a kidney everywhere in the world. Iran is a place where it's legal to sell your kidney but not to buy it. The government is the only monopolistic buyer. And yet there are robust markets for kidneys across the world that I'll talk about for a moment. So each of these raises different ethical issues. And the book is kind of divided between the legal side and the illegal side. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. But just to kind of start out on this, we've got questions about quality and information. How do you know where you should go? How do you know what is a good quality provider or not? Also issues about follow-up care, for example. Questions about legal liability. When something goes wrong, who can you sue in medical malpractice? How does civil procedural doctrines about jurisdiction, form nonconvenience, choice of law interface with this? Then I have a chapter based on private insurance. When can your insurer incentivize or maybe even force you to go abroad for coverage? How should that be regulated? Public insurer, how does this work in the EU? Should we be thinking about this for Medicare or Medicaid, for example? And then what is the effect on all this on the destination country's access to health care? Does this make things worse for poor Indians, for example, or does it make it better, and to whom? What are the distributional consequences, and how should they move us? The second part of the book focuses on the illegal side, so transplant tourism, which I'll talk about more in a moment, travel for assisted suicide and abortion, travel for fertility tourism, and experimental therapies. And let me say a minute more about that in a sec. So this is, I'm often told picture is worth 1,000 words, so here's a couple picture. This picture could have big dollar signs on it. This is the motivation for a lot of the legal travel. If you look at the bypass line over here, this is cardiac bypass. This is one estimate, it's not perfect, but roughly correct on scale. You're talking about, as a out-of-pocket person, your cost in getting a bypass in India, about 5% what you'd pay in the US. As an insurer, about 10%. That's probably a bit on the high side. Usually the expectations you're going to pay 10 to 20% of your total costs in the US if you go to India, Thailand, or Mexico, or the like. That's a huge cost savings. As an individual who can't afford health care, that may be make it or break it whether you can get something like a knee replacement or a hip replacement. As someone with an insurer-covered program, the insurer can send you abroad, take its 80% cost savings, give you 20% of that back, You end up happy in theory. They end up happy because they've saved this money. And there could be huge savings and gains. But there are issues about forcing people to go. When are incentives appropriate? What is the quality of continuity of care? What are the issues of liability? What happens when people bring back multi-drug resistant bugs to the US and infect an entire hospital, for example? Another picture, surrogacy. So here I've given you a juxtaposition. Up here, having a baby should be a precious gift, not a massive debt, a very typical advertising for surrogacy tourism. Down here, a picture of the Ankansha Fertility Center in Ankansha, India, one of the big ones. Oprah had these people on her TV show and, was celebratory. The women live in bunk beds like this. It's like camp in some ways. They have to live away from their families. Oftentimes, it might be an aunt and a niece together serving as surrogates. They make a huge amount of money compared to what they get in the Indian labor market, but they also have to have their diet controlled, their autonomy controlled. They will have to pay back what they've made if they have an abortion. And the number of fetuses transferred, the number of embryos transferred, the conditions under which certain things are made decided may not be in their interests. How should we think about this? Is this exploitation or undue inducement, or is this actually a great opportunity for these women? Should countries that ban commercial surrogacy also have an extraterritorial application of that law to people who go abroad for surrogacy? What should happen with children who may end up stateless if the home country doesn't recognize children born through commercial surrogacy in India? And lastly, I'll just show you a little bit about transplant tourism, another set of images juxtaposed. This is what it looks like when you have a kidney transplant. This is the nephrectomy scars of men in Bangladesh, right? One of the major places you go to buy a kidney. They're 12 inches long. In America, the nephrectomy scar is maybe an inch, maybe a little bit longer than that, but hardly noticeable. These men, again, are promised a huge amount of money to do this, and many of them are using it to buy themselves out of forced labor, afford a dowry, get a market stall. They usually only get paid about 2/3 of what they're promised, but even 2/3 vastly exceeds what they get paid in the labor market in general, and that labor market may have its own health consequences. How should we judge this trade? Is this undue inducement or exploitation, or is this something that we should, if not encouraging, be tacitly acknowledging and accepting? How should we regulate it? Should the U.S. refuse immunosuppressive drugs to people who buy kidneys from illegal sources? Should we have criminal prohibitions? What responsibilities do we have on the demand side for the demand for kidneys? These and many other questions are the questions I tackle with this book, but I don't want to talk more about it. I'm really excited to hear what my esteemed colleagues come from very different disciplines have to say about this. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you'll enjoy what they have to say and enjoy the book. Sure. Ollie, you want to go next? Okay. I'm going to load your slide if I can find it. Is this you? Yeah.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you for inviting me. I come from the world of economics where we write really short papers, and we certainly don't write big books and are not very good at reading them. So I had to put together a reading group, and so some of you are probably part of the reading group that I had to put together to basically read Glenn's books in chapters. But what I thought would be helpful is to put Glenn's book into the context of some of the larger conversations that we're having in the United States around reforming the delivery system in the United States. So I am speaking in my capacity as a health economist and also as a Massachusetts Special Commissioner for Provider Price Reform. Massachusetts, as many of you know, is trying to lead, as it has in the past, once again, in doing something about growing healthcare spending. And so let me give you a small preview into how we're thinking about things in Massachusetts and how many of the insights into the book fit into what's happening in the United States. So when I think about the organization and financing of medical care in the US, here's how I sort of think about it in a very schematic way. You've got a healthy person who can continue to be healthy, or that healthy person at some point something bad happens to them and they develop like a chronic illness, and the chronic illness may be resolved through successful management, or the chronic illness might require, it leads to an acute episode. So an example would be the chronic illness is something like diabetes, the acute episode is something like the leg amputation. Or the chronic illness is congestive heart failure or heart disease, and the acute episode would be a heart attack. And then after the heart attack, the patient would continue to need post-acute care. Okay, and then what happens with each of these health shocks is one needs access to primary care physicians, one needs access to specialty physicians, one needs access to prescription drugs and lab testing. And this is true in the chronic illness phase, this is true during the acute episode, this is true during the post-acute care. Now, where I'm going with this is what I want us to start to think about is where would medical tourism serve as a substitute? So in other words, what kinds of care would medical tourism substitute for? So this is kind of how we think about the organization and financing of healthcare right now. When I think about medical tourism, I am drawn to a small fraction of services that don't show up in the transition from chronic care to acute care to post-acute, as much as the fraction of services that I think of as being mostly elective services. So elective doesn't mean that you don't need them. Elective just means that different patients may disagree on whether they want them or not. But there too, I need access to a hospital, I need access to pharmacies, I need access to specialty physicians, so on and so forth. In the US, the scope for elective surgeries is actually quite high. They tend to be primarily in 3 areas of medicine. Orthopedics, so hips and hearts are where a lot of the elective surgeries occur. They tend to lend themselves to bundle payments. So rather than needing a lot of follow-up care and post-acute care, you go in, you need a shoulder repair surgery done, or you need a mitral valve replacement put in. It's a one-off surgery. And if it's done well, hopefully there's not a whole lot of need for post-operative care, and that's important for medical tourism, because I don't think it's going to be the case that people in Boston are going to be flying to Dubai both for the mitral valve replacement and for the follow-up care, right? That's unlikely to happen. It's much more likely to happen for something like shoulder repair surgery or one of these one-off things that happen to patients who are broken more than patients who are sick. And if you look at the distribution of health spending data, the vast majority of patients, not the vast majority of spending, the vast majority of patients are often broken. They're not sick. And so that provides a great opportunity for medical tourism. Okay, now where we're going in the United States is actually we are moving towards something quite different. We're thinking about encouraging episode payments. So what we're moving towards is a model that's different than medical tourism. We're moving towards a model where we go to the MGH hospital or we go to the Brigham and we say we will pay you a fixed amount of money to take care of Amitabh's heart attack, so that would be the acute episode. And then along with that, we will give you money that is meant to take care of all the post-acute care that he would need. So we're moving towards that model. And the hope is that once we have figured out how to do these episode payments, we will eventually be able to do something called capitation, which is we give the provider group a fixed amount of money to take care of Amitabh, regardless of whether the acute episode manifests itself or whether he can be managed with chronic disease. So this is at least 10 or 15 years away at this point. And again, I wanted to kind of put that up there because you can see what the scope for medical tourism would be in a world like this. Where I think we have a lot of opportunity from medical tourism is in the following set of graphs, where I think medical tourism could actually force a lot of providers to learn their cost structure better, and through learning their cost structure better, introduce some sort of price competition. So this is variation across hospitals right here in Massachusetts on costs for appendectomy. So it's all Massachusetts hospitals that did a sufficient number of appendectomies. A number like 1 says that you're an average price hospital, and you can see there are some hospitals that are about 75% of the average. There's others like the Brigham and Women's and the MGH that are about 30% higher than average. So we're seeing, incredible price variation for a relatively commodified area of medicine like appendectomy, right? And so the hope is if something like appendectomy moved to a medical tourism model, people could still choose which hospital they could go to, but these hospitals would all be coming under competition from appendectomy centers, say in Central America, and that would force them to learn their cost better. And because it forces them to learn their cost better, maybe we will start to see more price competition, and some of this variation would be eliminated. We see similar variation for vaginal delivery in Massachusetts hospitals. Again, the purple line just shows that quality is basically constant across all these hospitals, but again, we're seeing price price difference is, on the low end, there are hospitals that are about 25% cheaper than the average hospital. On the high end, a lot of the partners hospitals are about 30% higher than average. And it does not translate into better outcomes for patients, again suggesting that some of this markup reflects, for I think the polite term that economists use is market power. So let me kind of put this together with what we see as another opportunity. These blue dots reflect the performance of 3,690 American hospitals in how they treated heart attack patients. So each blue dot is an American hospital treating heart attack patients. On the y-axis, going from bottom to top, is the performance of these hospitals in 1-year survival for those heart attack patients. And on the x-axis, you can see how much was done to those patients as measured not by the quality of care as much as the quantity of care. And so what you should see is, first of all, just focus on the y-axis, you see tremendous variation in performance. You see hospitals where 1-year survival was 64%. You see other hospitals where 1-year survival was 76%. And if I were having a heart attack, I definitely want to go to one of the hospitals at the very top of this cloud. Notice also that there's no association between quality as measured by survival and how much was done to those patients. So there was clearly a lot of variation in what was done to patients for a fairly protocolized area of medicine. There's a lot of consensus in how a heart attack should be treated. This variation is a lot more when one wanders into grayer areas of medicine like the treatment of congestive heart failure. Again, this is another way of saying we don't have a whole lot of competition in American healthcare. Right? A lot of healthcare is consumed locally. There's not a whole lot of transparency around cost and quality, and so this kind of variation persists. Now, I don't think there's a single heart attack patient who would be shipped even from 02138 to the Newton Wellesley Hospital for a heart attack treatment, but the hope would be that some form of medical tourism around, say, perhaps not heart attack treatments, but say angioplasty for stable coronary disease could inject price competition on what all these hospitals are charging for angioplasty, and so we might be able to shrink some of the variation on the x-axis. However, what we really care about is the variation on the y-axis, right? The cost of going to a hospital that has a 64% survival rate swamps the dollar savings in some sense. So the real test of medical tourism is how well are we going to be able to measure performance? How well are we actually going to be able to measure the quality of care that patients are receiving? It's going to be a lot easier to measure costs, but that may or may not translate into the quality of care that patients are receiving. Now, this is an example of the kind of opportunity that medical tourism this is the kind of example of the kind of opportunity that medical tourism could help with. This is a brochure that I got from a large medical imaging device company. And it was sent to me because I think this device company thinks that I am a urologist. I'm not. I'm an economist, but I write about prostate cancer. So this brochure comes to me, and I just photocopied the brochure. It says capitalize on imaging opportunities in urology, and this is a urologist staring off into the sunset. And what I was struck by was this table in here, which is how much money I would make as a physician if I were to buy this imaging equipment, run it 1.8 times a day. In every case, I would run it 20 days a month. I would be paid $220 a year. Over 5 years, my return on investment would be I would break even if I ran it twice a day. Why would I want to break even when I could make $840,000? To do that, I would have to run it 5 times a day, in each case 20 days a month. Why would I want to make $840,000 when I could run the machine 10 times a day? In every case, I would be paid $220, and I would land up with a tidy profit of $2.1 million. Now, there's a whole separate conversation we can have around the problems of this kind of advertising. I don't want to get into that, but what I want to get into is the reason that we see a lot of the cost variation across hospitals is because there's great variation in the use of technologies like this. Technologies like this don't lend themselves to medical trials, and so even if doctors aren't financially motivated, there's going to be a lot of disagreement about whether this kind of CT is actually beneficial to patients or not. Some providers will adopt it, some providers will not adopt it. If we move to a model with medical tourism, ideally the hope is that a hospital in Thailand or a hospital in Dubai figures out whether or not this thing is valuable or not. And if it's not valuable, it's not going to adopt it. And if it is valuable, it will adopt it. And that will, again, it may or may not reduce price, but hopefully it will increase the value of care that patients are getting. But the key, again, is, are we able to measure patient outcomes? Because if we're not able to measure patient outcomes, all that will really happen is a race to the bottom, where what a lot of these providers will do is they will not adopt expensive things that do work, but they'll adopt a lot of the cheaper things. So that's really the big question with medical tourism. So I'm going to wrap up over here and say the optimistic part of me when it comes to medical tourism says, look, medical tourism could introduce a lot of much needed price competition into the American healthcare system. So in other words, it would benefit patients who don't even avail of medical tourism simply because of that price competition. What it's going to do is, price competition in turn forces providers to learn their underlying cost structure. And one of the biggest challenges in American healthcare is that our providers don't know their costs. Why don't they know their costs? Because they have no incentive to really know their cost. And so it's only when you come under some sort of price competition that providers will start to learn their cost. And ideally, that'll force them to, or encourage them to remove wasteful care and compete on the basis of price for those bundle payments. The tension, though, is this measurement of quality. Because if all we can do is measure costs and not measure quality, then there is going to be this race to the bottom where the way I compete for patient dollars is really not to provide the things that are expensive that work, but provide the things that are essentially not that expensive and aren't that great for patients. So that's really the question. And I think related to the quality component, there is a question in healthcare on whether the self-pay patients even needed the care that they sought out abroad. So an example of this would be, think about the area of prostate cancer innovation. Or innovation is what the manufacturers like to call it, but there's a lot of dubious treatments for prostate cancer. So I'm thinking here of something called the CyberKnife, for example. This is cybertactic body radiation therapy or proton beam therapy for prostate cancer. These are incredibly dubious medical technologies that the American healthcare system currently pays for, but the American healthcare system is not likely to pay for a year or two from now. If we stop paying for those technologies in the United States, but they're still available to patients in these other countries, how do we feel about patients essentially bankrupting themselves or spending a lot of their retirement monies seeking out care that is dubious? So it's not illegal, it's just dubious. And I sort of, I would love to get your thoughts, Glenn, and the rest of the panel's thoughts about that class of medical services where patients are spending their own money, but do we think that they have enough agency to sort of make the decision on whether this is valuable to them or not? Because if you look at the advertising for something like CyberKnife or Proton for prostate cancer, I got to tell you, even though I don't have prostate cancer, you look at these therapies and you think, wow, if I had prostate cancer, I definitely would want to be treated by a CyberKnife or a Proton facility. But the reality is we don't even have very good observational data on whether these things work. So the real question for me at the end of the day around the challenge of medical tourism is, well, we know that it's only going to operate in this area of care that lends itself to broken patients and bundle payments. I don't think we're going to be able to measure quality very well. We can be hopeful about it. Maybe we'll get there eventually, but in the short run, I think it's going to be extremely hard to do. So then the question is, in the absence of great quality measures, how much market learning is there? So I'm appealing to this economist idea of market learning, where in some sense the hope is that markets have a way of kind of aggregating minute pieces of information, and through some kind of very slow diffusion, patients and providers learn about who is the high quality provider and who is not, even in the absence of explicit quality reporting. We don't really know how much market learning goes on in healthcare. There's evidence on both sides of the aisle on this. There's a lot of evidence that patients in the absence of great quality measures do figure out where to go. And then there's a lot of evidence that shows that they basically leave it to the vagaries of the ambulance driver who comes to pick them up when they complain about chest pain. So I think those are the big unanswered questions for me, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
I take it that my presentation is going to be quite different from Amitabh's, and you're going to get a lot of different perspectives on the panel on medical tourism. But first I wanted to say really what an extraordinary book this is, and how incredible the taxonomy of both the various kinds of medical tourism there are, not just for when we're broken, but also for other things, as Glenn pointed out, is, and also looking at impacts beyond just the material impacts on the actual people who are involved, but also looking more broadly at societal, material, and symbolic impacts as well. So I really commend the book to all of you. I think it's on sale somewhere around here. But it's really an incredible work of research. And I'm delighted and honored to be here. So I'm a human rights lawyer, and I teach at the School of Public Health, and I take it that my role here is to talk something about human rights and relate it in some way to medical tourism. So that's what I'll do. I also, by the way, have experienced medical tourism of the atypical kind. Living in Tanzania, my son got very, very ill, and we went to South Africa for care. And after 8 weeks, he had managed to recover sufficiently. So I've experienced this phenomenon in my own life as well. So to begin with, rules and regulations in this field, as in any field, encode ethical and legal subjectivities. And they provide narratives of who we are as human beings. And for most of the book, and you saw from Professor Chandra's presentation, that there's sort of an assumption that humans are consumers and that healthcare is a commodity to be consumed. So it's especially true maybe of the part of the book that deals with treatments that are legal at home and in destination countries, the kinds of things that Professor Chandra was talking about, hip replacements, knee replacements, et cetera. But not exclusively. So here the regulations and proposals for channeling and the liability discussions are essentially concerned with consumer protections. And Glenn pays a lot of attention to working out the inefficiencies in market regulation, the asymmetries of information and power, which I think, which go in multiple directions, and I think is very well done. But of course, humans are actually more than consumers. And there's also another narrative that runs through the book, which is of people as patients with unmet needs, either because of long delays in their home country or financial inaccessibility, and inaccessibility has exogenous factors, or because a certain treatment is illegal in the home country but not in the destination country, as I'll come back to abortion in a minute, or illegal in both, as in transplants, but because of lax regulation or enforcement, they can get it in a destination country. And there, the ethical and normative discussions are naturally very different, and they examine questions of coercion and consent, and again, I think quite carefully handled. Nevertheless, in human rights, as well as in other ethical frameworks, SENS capability, for example, human beings are not just people with needs. They're citizens with claims, including in many parts of the world, I know it's hard to believe in the United States, but with actual legal entitlements to a right to health and health care. So first of all, to say that patients are citizens or that exercising claims to health care should be an asset of citizenship immediately raises the question of legal citizens versus residents versus undocumented, and I'm not going to really get into that. A human rights-based approach would look at social citizens as human beings, as social citizens in a broad sense because they reside in and work in and participate in social, cultural, and other aspects of political life and society, and they participate in constructing the institutions necessary to make rights real in a welfare state. So Glenn mentions the notion of a right to health at various points in the book with some degree of skepticism, I should say, about what it means and how its content can be defined. And again, Sen provides a useful way, I think, of thinking about what it could mean to say that health is a right. He says that to define it as a right implies, one, that it's of special moral importance, and two, that it's subject to social influence. And that it's of special moral importance has been quite persuasively argued, I would say, on both normative and empirical grounds. It's the idea that it's related to this distinction that Kant draws between what has dignity and what has a price. And if something is fundamental to dignity, as rights are, there should be fundamental to the idea of pursuing a life plan. Which health, there's abundant evidence that it is critical to be able to do that, to preserve a normal range of opportunities or certain capabilities. Then it shouldn't be treated just like any other commodity in the market. It shouldn't be allocated by the price mechanism. And the second requirement then sets out for thinking about health as a right is that it be subject to social influence. And here, under international law at least, and under many national constitutions, there is a right to health and not just health care. We can't claim a right to beauty or grace or Lionel Messi's soccer skills or Szymborska's poetic voice, because those are questions of gifts. But rights require societal arrangements, just as we're all familiar with the right to fair and free trials or due process. And economic and social rights, like the right to health, also require societal arrangements. So the consequence of considering health as a right are that the state has a duty to level the playing field in terms of basic preconditions of health and health care. And these cannot just be left to the market or a state to regulate the interstices of where the market is failing. A right to health does not call for equalization of all outcomes. There's obviously no right to be healthy, but there's an obligation on the part of the state to provide certain minimum standards, enough to live a life of dignity or enjoy certain capabilities as Nussbaum writes. And it's set out with more specificity under international law and, of course, has been interpreted in national legislation in many, many countries where there is such a right, in fact. And also to regulate private actors, like these hospitals in destination in countries where medical tourists go. So for example, the Apollo Hospitals chain in South Asia, which provides services to medical tourists, was denying care to indigent Indians. And the Delhi High Court, this is mentioned in the book, the Delhi High Court ruled that violated their rights to health care, conceived as part of the right to life under the Indian Constitution, which is amply interpreted under the Indian Constitution. But for the court, it wasn't merely a matter of equity in meeting patients' needs. It was a matter of reconceptualizing those poor Indian wretches who might be left out of for-profit private health care as active claimants, members of Indian society with assets of citizenship. So it turns out, and Glenn has an allusion to this in the book, that the decision was not terribly successful because Apollo chose the cheapest possible outpatient treatments to give to the indigent patients and kicked out the inpatients very quickly. So women were having babies and being kicked out within 24 hours precisely because the state was not regulating Apollo, which is an enormous hospital chain, effectively enough. And there is a question about whether it's realistic. At certain points, Glenn argues that, well, some of these failings or disparities or bad impacts we could anticipate are the fault of the destination government, so we should put some onus on them to regulate, which I agree with, but there's some question about the feasibility of expecting that. The other consequence of treating health as a right is that we think differently about health systems. For the most part in global health, health systems and their components are understood in a kind of mechanistic or technical perspective. Health systems are defined as comprised of a series of actors, interventions, the building blocks of WHO, which can be rearranged and applied anywhere. And you see this constantly in global public health, and it's something that Professor Chandra somewhat referred to in terms of the issues he was outlining. But a rights perspective on health systems is very different. One objective of a health system is, of course, to ensure equitable access to technical interventions necessary to promote health and treat disease. But we have often failed to grasp, I believe, in global health, the extent to which abusive, marginalizing, or exclusionary treatment by the health system has come to define the very existence of being poor. We have failed to grasp that the converse is also true, that the health system could be thought of as a core social institution, as part of the very fabric of social and civic life, which has enormous potential to contribute to substantive democracy as well as democratic development. So if health systems are understood as core social institutions, more akin to justice systems than, say, the postal service or some other delivery apparatus, it follows that the choices to be made can't be seen as technical choices, but are actually reflecting and embedding values and norms of the larger society, including in relation to equality, dignity, and rights. So the ways priorities are set from the most macro to the most micro levels of decision-making reflect and encode social norms. But it would also have a necessary change in how we think of medical tourism. So, for example, which brings me to the last 2 points I want to say. So there is an accountability to the citizens, and there needs to be a legitimate kind of participatory process in setting priorities, the kinds of things that Professor Norman Daniels talks about in Accountability for Reasonableness, that Glenn also alludes to in the book, Professor Daniels' work. So, which brings me to 2 last points. There's some issues, such as abortion, where there do not exist the political opportunity structures whereby people can advocate for change within a health system in terms of the legality of that procedure, service, which only affects women and can in fact be a life-saving intervention. So in those situations, it seems to me that those are exactly the kinds of situations where we want, A, legal opportunity structures to exist, so courts can uphold the rights of minorities, which are fundamental to dignity. Many, many constitutional courts throughout the world have held that reducing, not allowing exceptions to abortion for sexual assault or for the life and health of the mother reduce women to wombs without consciences, take away their possibility of dignity in life. So there's the question of those. And in international law, it's very clear that life does not begin at conception. The Artavia Murillo case definitively determined that. It's very clear that overly restrictive abortion laws violate equality rights. So those cases seem to me exactly where we would want to encourage freedom of movement. In fact, Ireland, which has a very restrictive abortion law, has special visas which allow people to travel to the UK. In their hypocrisy, admittedly, but hypocrisy which allows Ireland to maintain a very, very low maternal mortality ratio despite what the law says, which is also a claim about what law is and when it has a moral claim on us. And I think in something like abortion, and many of the issues touched on in the book, you know, the expressive function and the horizontal, informal functions of law, as well as the instrumental functions, are important to consider. So that brings me to my last somewhat disconnected point, which is when these priority-setting processes within health systems are not functioning correctly, or they aren't legitimate, even when a right to health exists. And this is something that did not get discussed in the book. There are countries like Colombia where over 1 million right to health cases have been granted in the last, say, 15 years. And there's been judicially led reform from the Constitutional Court, restructuring the health system according to rights principles. Nevertheless, priority setting is not trusted as legitimate. It's a very asymmetrical, very unequal society. There's constant litigation. This was just in the news this week and was just resolved yesterday, of people who need expensive treatments In this case, it was a young girl who had a rare form of leukemia who sued and initially won to be treated at the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston for an initial cost of $678,000 plus. Colombia is a country that spends approximately $7,500 per capita on health care per year. And that was the decision that was taken as on the basis of her right to health. So I think that and those cases to me raise really fundamental questions about ethics and achieving universal health coverage, the connections between formal equality and universalizability, when substantive equality may conflict with formal equality. So I think those are other questions that also relate to medical tourism. So I will leave it there, and again want to congratulate Glenn on a really spectacular book. Thank you.
Patients with passports will be crucial to any foreseeable future discussion of medical tourism. Since medical tourism will be crucial to future healthcare, this book is a major contribution. It is also a major contribution, because it is compellingly authoritative and jaw-droppingly comprehensive. Finally, it is just very helpful. As Alicia mentions, the taxonomies, a battery of pertinent distinctions, something that Glenn Cohen was always very good at making, will greatly advance the field. Chapter 6 of Patients with Passports discusses a concern that we can put as follows. Medical tourism is in many ways a win-win, but it might not be a win-win-win-win. In fact, it may be a win-win-win-lose. And the losers might be some of the world's poorest and most underserved patient populations. Let me be more specific. There is a widespread concern that medical tourism exacerbates internal brain drain within destination countries. If that is so, medical tourism may ultimately harm the health of some of the sickest and poorest patient populations in remote rural locations. In particular, I'm thinking about India and Northeast Thailand. India and Thailand are currently the global hubs with the most kind of tourist movement. The worry is that higher wages and advanced technologies available at facilities offering medical tourism services will lure in healthcare providers working in public and rural facilities. This could ultimately leave poor locals without caretakers because they had relied on public services that have lost their workers, and because demand from richer foreign medical tourists prices them out of access to private services. The concern is that financial gains medical tourism offers are rarely expected to benefit the big losers from that tourism. Revenues to destination country government from taxation, from tourism and the money they spend will not reach the poor if India and many governments in its federal system continue to invest so little in public health. Profits to urban hospital chains and local doctors and their families provide no comfort to the poor. The savings for medical tourists do not either. Even when some tourists are poor in Western terms, they are rich or middle income in global terms. So the process, if it is real, may exacerbate global inequality in health and income and harm some of the world's most vulnerable populations in absolute terms. Chapter 6 includes three main discussions. It's a very rich chapter. One assesses how real is this process. So what I've just told you, is that what's happening on the ground? Is it as simple as that? In earlier published work, Glenn was skeptical of the concern I've just outlined, emphasizing, for example, that tourist hospitals also lure providers back from abroad, a very real process, and also into the profession. So there is money to be had in medical care for once. Maybe I'll go into medical care, not IT. I'll study that. But I read the book, I don't know if Glenn would accept that interpretation, as reacting to criticism by conceding that while more rigorous studies would always help, and I'm pretty much quoting now, we are unlikely to have the results of this kind of crucial analysis anytime soon, We must make decisions in conditions of uncertainty, and as a whole, the evidence, continuing to quote, amassed is suggestive. I think that's a little out of context. I don't know if that, so good, I'm happy that I, so I believe Glenn now concedes it is reasonable to act as though net harm to the local poor is real. I concur. From the point of view of remote rural populations, it makes no difference whether doctors are unavailable because they aid the global rich abroad or the global rich in the metropolis, nor is it likely that many of those who enlist in medical schools and planning to find jobs in tourist hospitals will somehow wind up helping the local underserved. This is a very real concern. In fact, recently, our best experts on Thailand's universal health coverage system from Thailand and global institutions have concluded that the private hospitals in Bangkok are one of the major obstacles to the success of that system, basically because of something like what we've just described. Glenn next asks whether this reality, let us assume, generates ethical duties, say for tourists, for governments, for the government of the tourist, for the destination country government, for international institutions, who, if any, must do something about this, and later on we'll also discuss what they could do. He examines what a variety of cosmopolitan, statist, and hybrid political theorists would say on these duties. I could not possibly do justice to Glenn's many discussions there. He really covers many, many theories and has interesting points on each. But let me advance a few considerations that seem to me to establish duties for parties well positioned to make a dent in this problem. Suppose you could realize some savings, but you knew that that would affect badly the basic health interests of some of the world's poorest and sickest populations. For example, if you got an operation for cheap, impoverished women with no alternatives would be denied operations. Maybe similar operations, maybe many women would be denied the exact same operation, and all you did was to save money. Should you still do it? There are complications in the fraction of patients where it's not just about the money, but the differences in money amount to a sort of deal breaker, and you would have to sacrifice significant health interests of yourself in that case. But more pertinently for policy purposes, if some actor could put in place a law or an international code or hospital accreditation standard or consumer boycott or whatnot that could prevent you from saving money at the expense of far more vulnerable and poorer others in greater numbers, or even allow you to save nearly as much money without inflicting that harm, that could also be, with several stages in the process, the result of some moves at the macro level. Shouldn't they do it? When medical tourism harms populations that are highly vulnerable and badly off, both in absolute terms and compared to global middle class and upwards tourists and local elites, utilitarian and prioritarian considerations mount a strong presumption, I think, in favor of intervention of some kind if it could be effective. Even plausibly limited extra weight by the tourists' home countries to their own citizens would rarely override this strong presumption. And international institutions and accreditation bodies clearly shouldn't be partial to any one country's citizens over the others in the first place. Glenn considers similar considerations and says, among other things, that, so he looks at prioritarian and utilitarian theories and says interesting things about them. Among other things, that while the victims of medical tourism are poor and underserved often, there are in the world even poorer and less served populations, perhaps in other parts of India, perhaps in parts of rural sub-Saharan Africa. Why are we focused, if we are playing the prioritarian game, why are we focused not on the very poorest populations? Why, moreover, ethical theories, ideally, he says, have some chance of convincing decision makers, and to be realistic or pragmatic, the aloof US public, for example, is rarely impressed by the plight of the global poor as such. Let me answer Glenn by pointing out another feature of the impact of medical tourism on health worker availability for the poor in destination countries. When tourists, insurers, and hospitals actively make attractive job offers to public clinic physicians and nurses, and the result is harm to the health interests of patients depending on these practitioners, that harm is active harm doing takes place. I believe this matter, but in a more complex way than I bet some of you now assume I shall argue it is relevant. What I don't believe this potential for active harm does is to make medical tourism wrong immediately and measures to curb its bad effect supremely urgent. Take an analogy. Suppose that Yale actively offered Glenn Cohen oodles of dollars to move there. And he did.
I thought you were listening. Sorry, go ahead.
That would totally harm you guys. He's a wonderful presence for all of us. But it's not an active, and so it would be active, it would be harm. It's not an active harm of a wrongful type. And it would not be urgent for Harvard or Yale or UNESCO to stop that from happening. The active harm element doesn't matter intrinsically. So it's just not the case, despite what some of my philosopher colleagues will tell you, that any harm doing is some sort of wrong and something that it's urgent, if you read Thomas Pogge or others. It's more complex than that, even from a deontic point of view, I think. Where the active harm matters is precisely because I believe it stands a chance to move an aloof US and European public to do what they should have done about global poverty more broadly. In this one area, I can imagine regulatory frameworks, global codes of practice, and most promisingly, I believe, helpful action by accreditation bodies. So the active harm aspect matters not intrinsically, but precisely because of the realistic or pragmatic considerations that Glenn invoked. Glenn concludes chapter 6 by getting down to policy level and asking which agents are best positioned to address this concern, and by what means. He makes many good points, and I would like to end by agreeing with him on one point that he emphasized, namely that the hospital accreditation body, Joint Commission International, JCI, that's an arm of JCO, which instigates dread in the Harvard hospitals when they come to inspect them. These tourist hospitals totally rely on JCI. Without JCI accreditation, no referrals, taken very seriously there. Suppose they added to their 300 standards something about, you know, what by Indian law you were supposed to do anyhow, keep 10% of your beds, Apollo, to the local poor. Actually, we want you to do that. Actually, we want you to be paying your workers 12 months a year and expect them to spend 3 of those doing something helpful to the local community, maybe even in remote rural villages. If they said that, it would have to happen. I don't think that it would jack up it wouldn't have huge effects on, it would have some effects on prices, but not utterly dramatic effects. Industry could continue with some regulation such that there is net benefit and not net harm to local patients. So I think because JCI is so well positioned to make a difference for good, a dramatic good, they really should. JCI is almost uniquely positioned to turn medical tourism from a source of additional strife to poor and remote patient populations in India and Thailand, and perhaps elsewhere, and make it into a win-win-win-win. It would be inexcusable if JCI wasted that opportunity.
So I think we're basically at the end of time. Let me just say 2 things. First, one announcement. Holly will kill me if I don't. There is material about the Petrie Flom Center over there, and you can sign up, and also information about writing for the Journal of Law and the Biosciences. The more important thing I wanted to say is one of the great pleasures of working at Harvard University is to constantly feel like the dumbest person in the room. For me, that's always been the case, in that I listen to my colleagues and I'm like, wow, they're really smart. So these people are really smart. But they're also constructive. It's very easy to disagree with someone. It's very hard to disagree with someone in a way that makes their own arguments better. And through the course of writing this book, I've had many conversations with these people and with other of my colleagues that have really made the book better. And even today, I think if I had another year to work on it, I could make it even better still. But I'm incredibly grateful for them for being such wonderful colleagues with the time I've been here, and for all of you for coming here. And I hope you'll enjoy the book, and I hope you'll find this an interesting thing to talk about and to read read more about. And as Nir says, it is an urgent thing. If you care about global justice and you care about the plight of the poor, this is one fulcrum that is available to us to think about how to do better. So thank you so much for coming.